When I was a child, my parents chose to abandon me because I didn't measure up to my twin sister's intelligence. Years later, when they attempted to reconnect, I introduced them to my new family, and things didn't go as they had hoped. A decade ago, when I was just 12, my parents sent me to live with my uncle, my father's older brother, in the countryside. They felt I was a burden and preferred to focus on raising my twin, who they believed had greater potential, and I can't deny it, she was indeed much more intelligent than I was. I struggled to keep up, often falling into the realm of mediocrity, which was unacceptable in a family of overachievers. Both my parents were doctors, and they expected my sister and me to follow in their footsteps, but I never shared their ambition. My passions lay elsewhere, primarily in the creative arts, which I longed to pursue. The pressure from my parents was overwhelming, and my academic performance plummeted. Instead of encouragement, I faced constant insults and harsh comparisons to my sister. This pattern of treatment, familiar since my childhood, only escalated over time, making it increasingly difficult for me to concentrate on my studies. By middle school, I was struggling academically, failing most of my classes despite my best efforts. Teachers assumed I was lazy, unaware of the environment I endured at home. At school, my peers compared me unfavorably to my sister, who was thriving. Each night, I cried myself to sleep, haunted by my parents' daily reminders of my shortcomings and their overt affection for my sister. One fateful night, after another round of insults at dinner regarding my grades, I finally snapped and lashed out. They grounded me for 2 weeks, and in a moment of desperation, I decided to run away from home. Not knowing where to go, I made it only as far as a nearby park, where I sat alone, engulfed by loneliness and fear in the dark. My parents found me at dawn and had to call the police to bring me back home. Upon returning, they informed me that I would be living with my uncle and aunt. I begged them not to send me away, promising to improve and never disappoint them again, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. They told me they couldn't handle the burden of my failures any longer, especially with my sister's success to focus on. It was evident that they preferred her. I was merely an inconvenience. I didn't want to leave them, nor did I want to be separated from my sister, my only ally, but they forced me to say goodbye, not even allowing her to accompany me on the journey to my uncle's home. I cried for weeks, longing for my old life, trying to call my parents, who never answered. Eventually, I resigned myself to my new reality. I managed to stay in touch with my sister, but it was a secret affair. She didn't have a phone, so I called her on my uncle's landline when our parents were away. Social media was just beginning to gain popularity, and she would use the family computer to chat with me. Whenever the coast was clear, I would call her. Despite the distance, our bond endured, and we cherished each other deeply. As the years passed, she kept me informed about her life and our parents. Recently, she mentioned that they were planning to reach out to me, which gave me time to mentally prepare. After 10 years of silence, first due to their refusal to contact me and later my own lack of interest, I felt ambivalent about the prospect of reconnecting. Life improved significantly after moving in with my uncle and aunt. They didn't impose the same pressures as my parents, and my academic performance began to stabilize. While I wasn't a straight-A student like my sister, I at least managed to pass. My uncle and aunt encouraged my involvement in school plays and sports, activities my parents had strictly forbidden for fear they would affect my grades. Finally, I was able to enjoy life and build meaningful friendships without restrictions. That's how I met my husband, who has been my steadfast companion for 7 years. Since high school, we attended the same college, graduated together last year, and celebrated our marriage in an intimate ceremony shortly after. Last month, we welcomed our son into the world. We live in our own home just a few blocks from my uncle and aunt, whom we visit often so they can see their grandchild. I'm currently on maternity leave, relishing this precious time before returning to work. My sister and I have openly maintained our relationship for several years now. Once she turned 18, she felt no need to hide our connection from our parents. She stood by my side as the maid of honor at my wedding and is the godmother of my child. Just last week, while visiting, she mentioned that our parents were planning to come by. They were still unaware of my marriage or the birth of my son, as the family had cut ties with them after they abandoned me. A few days after her visit, my parents reached out through social media, simply asking if they could visit. No apologies, no acknowledgement of the past, just a straightforward request. I felt a mix of disappointment and anger. I had hoped for at least some recognition of how they had treated me. For a moment, I considered ignoring their message entirely, but then I had an idea. I decided to invite them over, eager to show them just how fulfilling my life had become without their influence. So, I sent them my address and invited them for dinner this weekend. I also invited my uncle, aunt, and sister, along with my husband and son, since the dinner was at my house. However, I didn't mention to my uncle and aunt that my parents would be there, so when everyone arrived last weekend, the surprise was palpable. It's been 3 days, and I'm still uncertain if I did the right thing. Once everyone settled in, the atmosphere was awkward. I hadn't seen my parents in a decade, and the rest of the family had cut them off too, including my uncle and aunt, who wanted nothing to do with them. The backstory is that my parents had promised to support me financially while I lived with my uncle, and they also vowed to stay in touch to meet my emotional needs. They delivered on the money part, sending it every month, but they never followed through with their commitment to keep in touch. It felt like they were relieved to be rid of me, which my uncle found unacceptable. He was disappointed that my parents were neglecting my emotional well-being and took it upon himself to advocate for me, ultimately informing the family about my father's actions. This revelation led everyone to cut ties with my dad, creating a rift between them, but he continued sending money until I turned 18. After that, there was no contact between them at all. After everyone greeted each other, we were supposed to have dinner, but I decided to make a toast first. Instead of easing the tension, I leaned into it, hoping to make my parents feel remorseful. I stood up to give a speech about how wonderful the past 10 years had been compared to my first 12. I directed my words to my uncle and aunt, acknowledging all they had done for me over the years. Without their support, I doubted I would have reached this point in my life. I also expressed my gratitude to my husband for his unwavering presence and thanked my sister for never giving up on me despite the challenges we faced. In my speech, I intentionally ignored my parents, as I had nothing to thank them for. They clearly noticed, remaining silent with their eyes cast down. After I finished, I decided to emphasize my point further. I turned to my parents and announced that I was ready to introduce them to my new family. Their shock was evident. They hadn't expected such a declaration. As soon as I mentioned my new family, my mother burst into tears and fled the scene. In hindsight, I can't help but think we would have been better off without all that drama. The dinner that followed was filled with a heavy silence, and no one lingered for dessert, which suited me just fine. While I don't like my parents, I also wonder if my actions were justified. I haven't had a chance to talk to my uncle and aunt since then, but my sister and husband both believe I took things too far. They think I shouldn't have engaged with my parents if I didn't want to interact with them, and that my comments were unnecessary. Update 1. The comments so far have been quite divided on whether I should apologize to my parents, but there's a consensus that I should at least reach out to my uncle and aunt. With that in mind, I decided to contact my uncle today. It's been a week since the dinner, and we hadn't spoken much since we were both busy. I also think the lingering awkwardness kept us from talking. Today, I called my uncle to address it. Before he could speak, I apologized for inviting my parents without giving him and my aunt a heads up. He admitted he was a bit shocked but eventually moved past it. He hadn't reached out sooner because he was unsure how I felt after that night, as I appeared upset. He acknowledged the awkwardness but said it was all water under the bridge now. After that, I called my aunt to apologize as well, and she had a similar reaction. Now that I've apologized to both of them, I feel less guilty. I still don't believe I owe my parents an apology, given everything they put me through in my childhood. I think anyone would understand my behavior. They haven't apologized to me yet, so I see no reason to apologize to them. I explained my stance to my husband, who initially suggested I apologize but understood my feelings about their past behavior. He didn't press further. I told my sister the same, and while she was skeptical, she ultimately agreed it was my decision since I was the one who had been wronged. She hasn't managed to contact our parents in the past week either. They've been oddly quiet. I suspect they're just laying low for now, but I'm sure they'll reach out soon, either demanding an apology or stirring up more drama. Update 2. I just want to clarify something. My sister isn't trying to maintain a good relationship with our parents. Even if she were, I'd be okay with that. I don't want her to be judged here. She understands that what they did to me was wrong, but she was young and couldn't have effectively protested at the time. She did her best to stay connected with me, and that's what matters. The reason she stays in touch with them is that they're getting older, and she feels guilty about abandoning them. It's not as deep as some might think, so please don't accuse her of anything. We have a strong bond and support each other, and I don't believe the comments about her are fair. As for the aftermath of the dinner, I suspected my parents wouldn't take it lightly. They aren't the type to let things go, so I was prepared for some retaliation. Today, 10 days after the dinner, it finally happened. They went public with the incident and posted all about it on social media. I found it quite surprising that my parents, who typically maintain a low social media profile, chose to post about a recent incident. Their post was predictably one-sided, emphasizing how hurt they felt without acknowledging any of their past actions that led to our strained relationship. I wouldn't have minded if they had directed their post to our family members, since none of them have a good opinion of my parents due to how they abandoned me. However, they were cunning enough to tag my co-workers and my husband's co-workers in their post, despite my husband having no involvement in the situation. Unbeknownst to my co-workers, my history with my parents and the challenges of our relationship meant they were caught off guard when they were tagged. They started messaging me almost immediately, and since I'm on maternity leave and not checking social media often, I was unaware of the post until they prompted me to look. I was taken aback and didn't know how to respond, especially since I suspected they had been online stalking me to find my co-workers' accounts through the pictures I had shared. When I finally saw the post, I was shocked for a moment but quickly decided to share my side of the story. I had nothing to hide. I was the victim here. I detailed how they dropped me off at my uncle's house years ago and then cut off contact, and even after they reached out, they never offered an apology. If they had acknowledged their past actions, perhaps I would have reconsidered my response at dinner, but I didn't feel I did anything wrong. I also made sure to clarify my stance with my co-workers who had been tagged, apologizing to them on my parents' behalf because they shouldn't be dragged into our family drama. I was understandably upset that my parents had not only targeted me but had also pulled my co-workers into this situation. I waited for my husband to come home to discuss it with him since he had an important client meeting that day, but I figured I could handle this on my own for now. I spoke with my sister, who agreed that our parents were being unreasonable. They likely couldn't handle the backlash from the dinner and reacted poorly, but that still didn't justify their behavior. I chose not to inform my uncle or aunt about the post because I knew they would react strongly, and I didn't want to burden them with the stress. Update 3. A few hours later, it was 8 p.m., and my house was filled with my uncle, aunt, sister, and husband. We were trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I wasn't interested in involving lawyers at this stage. I wanted to resolve it personally and keep legal action as a last resort. We had reached out to my parents multiple times to ask them to remove the post, but they had ignored our messages and left my comment up, allowing everyone to see the truth. The post was gaining traction, which concerned me because it painted me in a bad light. Acquaintances I had tagged also saw it, and now they were reaching out to me for clarification, which was getting exhausting. I didn't want this situation to escalate to the point of HR being involved, so I hoped we could resolve it quickly. My sister planned to visit our parents the next day to request they take the post down, and if they refused, I might have no choice but to pursue legal action. Update 4. Today, my sister visited our parents and had a lengthy discussion with them. They were upset, which she suspected prompted their post and the tagging of my coworkers. It was unsettling to know they had stalked me online to find that information. While that was creepy, I was more concerned about the implications. My sister relayed that they were willing to take the post down if I apologized first. I firmly told her that was not going to happen since I had done nothing wrong. Thankfully, she understood my position and communicated that to our parents. She warned them that if they didn't take the post down, I would consider pursuing legal action, which they ultimately took seriously. After an hour of discussion, they agreed to remove the post but also informed my sister that they would be cutting me out of their lives and inheritance. Honestly, that didn't faze me. I just wanted the post taken down. My husband and I are doing well on our own, financially secure without needing their support. My sister assured them of my feelings on the matter, so they understood where I stood. Now that this issue is behind me, I'm focused on spending quality time with my son during my maternity leave. Thank you all for the incredible support.